So connect this with this concept of lawfare, which people certainly would, from the coverage I've done, in my perception of the situation in Brazil and the prosecution of President Lula, that these sort of, particularly, I mean, Lava Jato in Brazil, but actually across Latin America, these sprawling anti-corruption investigations, which, first of all, they do tend to start broad, but then target the left. And then at times, maybe they conflate, corruption is such a big, all-encompassing word that it confuses, but when people hear it, I think they think, oh, okay, corruption, that means that somebody took, a health budget and washed it through a Swiss bank to, put in real estate investments or something. But what it might mean is somebody, just like in DC or anywhere else, political horse trading, working with the political realities of, your given situation so you can govern. And, I say that all to say that I'd like you to maybe speak on the broader themes of that, but a case that we have not covered a lot, but I know is close to you because you served in his government, is a recent conviction in absentia. I mean, Rafael Correa is not in Ecuador for this, but charges against him by the current Lenin Moreno government. And I guess I'm wondering, first of all, your sense of this lawfare role in terms of targeting the left in Latin America, and does the Correa case connect with that, or is that sort of on a different track? And what do you think of the merits of that case?
Yeah, sure. I think it completely is. I mean, it's one of the archetypal examples of the lawfare you've just described, right? So, going back to the coups of the 1960s and 1970s, it's probably not the preferred route to getting rid of the left, because the world has changed since 1967, 70. It would look bad. And so there have been all sorts of different strategies in order to try and prevent the Latin American left from returning to power. And, I think for the United States establishment and for the State Department, it was probably quite traumatic, and maybe it's a strong term, but maybe not, to have a majority of Latin American countries, depending on, obviously each country has different dates, but, by and large, between 2000 and 2015, it was tough US imperialism in Latin America, right? I mean, you had a lot of countries trying to establish sovereign institutions, sovereign states, and then sovereign, even regional institutions, creating alternatives to the OAS, not really playing the neoliberal game, not wanting the IMF in, not really wanting the World Bank in. Obviously, it'll depend from one country to the other, but by and large, this was not, and bringing China in as well as an important partner, diversifying relations, being very critical of the United States in multilateral fora. These were not good times for US domination in its backyard. And they wait, the United States essentially waited in different contexts. They had different strategies to try and turn that page. In some cases, such as in Argentina, they found sort of poster boys of neoliberalism that they could support, like Macri. In other cases, they couldn't win electorally. So they even organized coups, in some cases. But, and every single example is going to be different, but certainly lawfare has been a way of making sure that the threats, so the Lulas and the Correas of this world, cannot be elected. I think Lula and Correa are perfect examples of this. Lula was essentially in jail, held on bogus charges in order for him not to be able to run, because all the polls confirmed that he would win, and he would have won easily against Bolsonaro. And Correa, very similarly, he's not been in jail, but he's been abroad. He didn't flee Ecuador. He was already abroad when the trouble started because his wife is Belgian. So he announced before his term came to an end that he would be living in Belgium once he left the presidency. And it's exactly what he did. A few days after handing over the presidency to his successor, he left to Belgium, and the sort of lawfare caught him already outside of the country. And essentially, the purpose of that lawfare has been to prevent him from coming back. The problem is, of course, throughout Latin America, and that includes Ecuador, the return of neoliberalism is extremely unpopular. And you will recall that in 2019, last year, we saw a number of historic protests spread like wildfire throughout the region against essentially neoliberal reform, right? Neoliberal structural adjustment programs accompanied by the IMF. So you had them in Ecuador, the biggest protests in certainly in my lifetime, in my generation, but also in Chile, in Colombia, in Haiti, and a number of countries. In some countries where there were electoral outlets for people to express themselves politically, such as in Argentina, the left came back in, right? And if you look at the polls, certainly that's the case in Ecuador. Correa, if he was on the ticket tomorrow, he would win with a landslide. So they're very worried about that in Ecuador. We've got presidential and congressional, we call it National Assembly in Ecuador, but essentially congressional elections in February next year, so very soon. And Correa would be likely to win if he could run. So Moreno did two things. The current president of Ecuador, Lenín Moreno, did two things in order to avoid Correa from coming back. The first thing was to reform the constitution and prevent re-election. So re-election is now banned in Ecuador, so Correa can't run. However, he could run as vice president, and that would obviously boost the ticket, whoever the presidential candidate would be. With Correa as vice president, that would obviously boost the ticket. Another alternative would be for Correa to run as a member of the National Assembly of Congress, right? And that would also sort of boost the party. Also, it probably boost the presidential, vice presidential ticket and mean that it would probably lead to a parliamentary majority, which would be very important, right? So they're stopping him from doing this. They've invented these bogus corruption charges. It's really incredible. I mean, can't go into too much detail, but one of the proofs against Correa is a notebook written by one of his advisors at the time, who claims that, so she's written all the amounts that were received for illegal campaign financing in this notebook, right? This is the mother of all proofs. And she originally said, well, the notebook is dated 2014. Today, I have received such and such, and I've received so many thousands of dollars, and it's all down to the common sense and everything. And then the next day, today I've received so many from so and so. And she claimed originally that this was with presidential knowledge. So the Correa knew about this. But then it was proven that the notebook, written supposedly in 2014, came out of the press in 2018. So she changed the story, said, oh no, I remembered this and I wrote it on a flight one day from Quito, a 45-minute flight.
Oh, wait, I'm saying, you mean literally like the press that physically makes the notebooks?
The notebook.
Okay, just so people are clear. It wasn't released to the press in 2018.
Oh, no, sorry.
The physical object was not produced till 4 years later. Okay, yeah, go ahead.
That's correct.
Okay,
so she had to change the story and said she'd written all this from memory, but down to the exact cent, the exact person. At 10 o'clock this morning, they came, they deposited,
Probably not.
So, it's a whole shambles. But the order to the judges, who are under strict control here by the government, is not to let Correa go. Now, there's an appeals process, which they're speeding up illegally, because if by mid-September of this year is when people will register their candidacies for the February elections. And if they don't have a final guilty verdict against Correa by September, as in many parts of the world, once you've enrolled as a candidate, you're immune from prosecution, right? Until the elections are over. Otherwise, people would be persecuted left, right, and center in order to stop them from running. So from September onwards, they need a guilty sentence before September so they can block Correa from participating. So there's already a verdict, if you like, 8 years in prison and 25 years taking away his political rights, which blocks him from running in any election. But that verdict can still be appealed, right? And until the appeals process is concluded, Correa could still technically be a candidate. So they're essentially rushing things so it was amazing because under this COVID-19 crisis, the whole judiciary is closed down unless these extremely urgent matters, people who are in jail unjustly, you can appeal and you'll be heard. But all the non-urgent matters have been sort of delayed. But this was not. The court case against Correa was, everybody wore their masks and went to court. And so this is a typical case of lawfare in order to stop essentially democracy, right? It's an anti-democratic case of lawfare. Yeah.
Spend just, I want to, actually, before I want to get to China and Latin America, but just briefly, can you explain Lenin Moreno? Because this is an important character in the sense that he wasn't the party from the right that won. He actually was supposedly sort of going to carry on the Correa legacy, and he's reversed very aggressively. I mean, everything from the aiding in the political persecution of Julian Assange, which has implications for freedom of the press across the Western system, to a total reversal, if my understanding is correct, on the real social gains that were made in Ecuador under the Correa government. So what is the Moreno? And Lenin is not a mistake. He was named after Lenin. What happened?
It's actually not such an uncommon name in Ecuador, Lenin.
Oh, really? I thought he was actually named after the guy. No?
Yeah, of course. I mean, I'm sure. That's
okay, but it's not. But a lot of people are doing this. Okay.
Yeah, that's right. Quite common. So I wish I could explain it fully. I mean, obviously, been thinking about this for the last 3 years because it's been a major setback for Ecuador's political process. But essentially, Lenin is the archetypal historic sort of traitor, and there are a few throughout history. You can think of a few of them. A Shakespearean traitor, right? So his Trojan horse, who was elected, he had been Correa's vice president, right, until 2013, sorry, and was Correa's handpicked successor, or the party's handpicked successor. He was elected. He won the elections. And from the moment he was elected, from the moment he was sworn in, he started this 180-degree U-turn against Correa's policies, so including the economic and social policies, bringing back sort of neoliberal policies, deregulation, cutting back the role of the state, cutting back funding for social and for health and education. So one of the consequences, obviously, the COVID-19 crisis in Ecuador, because it's cut back massively the health sector, but also geopolitically. So sort of becoming really aligned with the Trump administration, going back to bilateralism, killing all of our initiatives in terms of Latin American integration. Ecuador was the seat of UNASUR, sort of the Brussels of this new South American Union, which was a very important project, one of the most important projects, on all sorts of levels, on development, on economics, but also geopolitically, in order to have more independence from the United States, and also more independence from anybody, to sort of interact as a sovereign bloc of states in the international system. Well, Ecuador got rid of not only its membership, but obviously it's the fact that it was the seat of this organization, which actually was also going to be very interesting for Ecuador in terms of its strategic integration in South America. Becoming the Brussels of South America is not necessarily a bad thing if you're a small country like Ecuador, right? Anyway, so you've already mentioned Assange. There's now a runway in the Galapagos Islands, which is extremely symbolic for Ecuador because the Galapagos Islands is like one of the gems of, Ecuadorian nationhood, if you like. And one of the runways is now being handed over basically to the, it's being used certainly by the US military, which is a big taboo, especially since the US had its biggest military base in South America was based in Ecuador until 2009, until Correa put an end to that. So that brings back sort of ghosts of the past, right? So all sorts, I mean, whichever sort of domain of public policy and, you look at, there's been a massive U-turn. And because Correa is still the biggest threat to that, because Correísmo as a political phenomenon and the Correa's political party, they've actually managed to take away the political party from Correa, but the movement still exists and would be the likely winner of next year's election. A lot of what Moreno's done is to persecute the followers of Rafael Correa and some of his closest collaborators. So a lot of people have had to flee into exile, including, elected members of parliament, Congress, right? Yeah. So a number of them have fled. And there was a whole, I don't know if you remember, the last year there was a whole ordeal with a number of members of Congress having to hide in the Mexican embassy, and then Mexico negotiating with Ecuador so that Ecuador could grant safe passage so that these people could actually go into asylum to Mexico. This eventually happened. Then you had elected officials from Correa's party, the equivalent of the governor of the state where the capital is in Ecuador. So a province called Pichincha, where Quito, the capital, is. So the governor of that state was arrested because she had supported supposedly the October protests. So they arrested her, like in the old days of the 60s and 70s, like they arrested her on rebellion, sort of like sedition, right? I mean, this is going back to the language of the persecutions against the left in the 60s and 70s. Really scary stuff, right? So that's sliding more and more into authoritarianism, essentially. And here there's a great contradiction, because Lenin Moreno has been trying to portray Correa as this terrible dictator, and that he really means a return to this kind of patrician form of democracy, right? The democracy of the elites, the liberal pact of the elites. But on the other hand, in order to be able to do this so-called democratization, which I would seriously question, he's had to be more and more authoritarian, because if he allows democracy to prosper, Correísmo would triumph. So this has been the huge, the situation, the cul-de-sac that Moreno has been in. And now on popularity or approval ratings, I mean, this was before the COVID-19 crisis, the latest polls, he was on 12%. So he's probably, he's probably even lower than that. And in Ecuador, we also measure credibility. So the question is, do you believe what the president says? And we've been doing it for 40 years or so. So it's interesting to see that evolve through time. And 7% of Ecuadorians believe what Moreno says. So he's probably the least believed, the least credible president since restoration of democracy in Ecuador after military rule in 1979. So that's how bad the situation is in Ecuador.